thank you very much for coming to our webinar. It's been a little while since we've done webinars, so it's good to be back and good to be talking to an audience and see a few names in there. Some of you who've been to some of these webinars before, and I think some of you maybe this is your second Moore Kingston Smith webinar of the day as well. So thank you for being diehard fans. Today we're going to be looking at the practicalities of running a strategy process, as the title explains, and just going to go through and explain a little bit about what we're going to do and what we're going to look at today. So we often see in the work that we do with different charities, helping them to develop their strategies. We see some pitfalls, and we also see what works well. So we're hoping that we can reflect some of that back to you today. People often confuse issues around strategy. So we're going to start with a bit of a recap about what is strategy, what are we talking about when we talk about strategy. And then we're going to jump straight into the heart of the matter and talk about the process itself, before covering some of the issues of where things can go wrong. So the main bit we'll be talking about processes. It's not going to cover what strategy should contain. We've done that in previous webinars, so do feel free to look on our website to find copies of those. This is all about the process of creating a strategy, the practicalities, and there will be time for questions, and so keep filling in, keep putting stuff into the Q&A box. We'll deal with them maybe as we go along or at the end. There will also be a short feedback survey at the end, so please help us by filling that in when we get to it. But first, a very quick introduction. For those less familiar with us, we're part of Moore Kingston Smith, a mid-sized accountancy and advisory business, which is also linked in with Moore Global, which is represented in 112 countries. So we have quite a wide reach. But in the non-profit advisory team, which is where I sit and where Mark sits, we focus particularly on working with non-profits and looking at impact strategy, finance and fundraising, as it says there on the slide. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things here. We've got a half-day training session on the 3rd of November, where we're going to go into the sorts of things that we're talking about today, but in a lot more depth. We try to keep numbers low in those sessions to allow participants time to sort of discuss issues with their peers. And we only charge £99 plus VAT for the half-day sessions, which we think is good value. And so that's coming up on the 3rd of November. Information about that will be in the email that follows this this webinar. And we're also running our first in-person seminar in the non-profit team for quite some time, for obvious reasons. And it's going to be in our new offices in Liverpool Street. So those of you who've been to us before, it's a new location, a much nicer, bigger, brighter location. So if you want to come along for an evening of non-profit VAT, followed by networking drinks and canapes on the 10th of November, do sign up for that. But we've got a lot to cover today, so we're going to move at pace. And I'm going to move on to the next slide and hand over to Mark to take us through some of the issues around what is strategy. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Just so that everybody knows, the chat function doesn't seem to be working. So please, if you've got questions as we go or any comments, just pop it into Q&A. We'll do the same as we normally do, which is we'll pick up the questions as they come. We'll answer those. And also feel free to be a little bit, controversial if you've got a different opinion or a different way of doing things or a better way of doing things. Please share with us. Yeah. So if you can go to the next slide, Dan. I think it's interesting because I started back at KPMG with a number of people that weren't really strategists, and also some really highly technical strategists. And what I found was that those people that were, if you like, the big thinkers and really were strategists, understood the difference between what is a strategy and what is tactics. Now, if you think about strategos, which was the Greek art of war, strategy is winning the battle. Yeah. Whereas strategy is winning the war, whereas tactics is fighting the battles. Yeah. In other words, the small things that you do to maneuver yourself, so eventually you're going to win the war. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting in the strategies that I've been involved in. especially with charities, we tend to dive straight into the tactics. Okay, we're going to get a new finance system. That's not strategic. Yeah. So in other words, it's something that we can do to move us towards helping and doing more and helping more people and having more social impact. But that alone is not a strategy. Yeah, it's just a tactic to get you there. Do you see that? Yeah. And so one of the things we tend to find with strategy processes is that this difference between strategy, which is what are you trying to achieve in the world, versus tactics, the battles you've got to fight to get you there, is not really that well understood. Yeah. So we're going to be talking at the umbrella level. We're going to be talking at this bigger level. So if you can go to the next slide, Dan. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way that I like to articulate strategy is Stanford Social Innovation Review did a lot of work around there. What's the lever you can pull to make the biggest change? So in other words, out of all the things you could put your resources to, what's the one that brings about the biggest change? And it's really interesting to reflect that as we've gone through this, Dan, there's quite a lot of eureka moments that the charity clients have. So, for example, when we worked with one YMCA organization, we were saying to them, okay, so you want to get 1 million women into employment across sub-Saharan Africa. That's great, yeah. If you want to do that, what's the biggest lever you can change to make that happen? And they suddenly thought, well, we've got a huge number of mentors that we can, turn to. And so actually the biggest lever they could get was to mobilize mentors to help make that change happen. So do you see, by really asking yourself big strategic questions, you can get there. Another example, I wrote the strategy for cats protection. Heather begged me to write the strategy. She was the chair of the organization. And the funny thing for me was, I didn't understand why she wanted me to write it, because I care about people. And so I wrote it about volunteers. Yeah. And I didn't realize that if you actually did more with volunteers and more with people, you'd help more animals. Yeah. So sometimes you just need to go and look for the biggest lever you can, pull, if you like, to make change happen. So next slide, Dan. Yeah. But there's also this thing that everybody has to be able to see their part of the strategy. Yeah, and their picture or their place in it. So, for example, here you've got the City of London. Everybody can see it's the City of London, but everybody sees it slightly differently. Everybody has a different feel to it. Everybody will interpret it slightly differently. And that's what we're talking about strategy. It's painting a good enough picture so that everybody is drawn to that picture and can see where they're going, with that, and can see their place in the picture. So good strategy is about articulating what it looks like in the future. And maybe you're here and you want to get here. Yeah, it's about articulating what it looks like in a future state. And then you've got the implementation plan, which is how you're going to get there. So I just thought I'd write down a couple of types of strategy process that I've been involved in. I mean, the first that I tend to get involved in all the time is rearranging assets. In other words, we've got these assets, we're doing these certain things. Should we change? Should we stop? Should we decide to do something slightly different? And the way that I look at that is by looking at the resources you have and mapping out how you might want to use those resources in a slightly different way, but not really doing very much different from what you've already done. It tends to lead to this idea, see the second bullet point down, of a refresh. Yeah. In other words, it's something where you're challenging yourself. Are you doing the most you can with the resources? Are you being the most efficient? And a refresh just looks at that in a slightly different lens. Yeah. Now that's very different from blue sky thinking. And the best example of blue sky thinking that I've seen is Caterpillar. Yeah. So Caterpillar used to build heavy machinery, and a group of management consultants came along and said, look, actually, you're gonna stop in the future, but you're not going to be able to exist because you can't sell heavy machinery. You're not as good as the Japanese. They said you should actually produce clothing. So Caterpillar should produce clothing. Wow, that's a totally different area. It's a totally different thing they're doing, but it has a profound effect. Yeah. And an example of where I worked on a strategy with an organization is Guide Dogs for the Blind. Well, they were seen as mobility with guide dogs, But suddenly, if they thought about mobility in a different way, they could actually articulate it for, visually impaired people totally differently away from dogs. And so Guide Dogs for the Blind became a mobility charity, not just around the animals. Yeah. So this blue sky thinking can drive you to think about strategy in a very different way. The fourth type that I see of strategy process is where people just want to get more efficient. They want a cost cut. Yeah. It's not really strategic. It's not really changing what you're trying to achieve in the world. It's not really painting a different picture. It's just doing it in a more efficient way. Yeah. So beware, that's a tactic you can use. Yeah. Not a strategy. And then the final thing here is, I tend to have a lot of conversations with organizations about, are you challenging little bits of what you're trying to do? Are you refreshing it? Or are you going to reimagine and rework what you actually do? So I thought I'd challenge you, first of all, with 5 different types of process that you can engage in. So are you just rearranging the assets you've got, or are you really thinking blue sky and differently, and doing that so that you can help more, you can create more social impact or help more beneficiaries in future? Next slide, Dan, if you can. And so, we've used this in previous webinars that we've done. Charles Handy, the great economist, said, know when to reimagine. So on the right-hand side, you've got this maturity curve, see, coming up. If you just let that maturity curve go to decline, you see, to the end, you have to go all the way down before you start to reimagine and come back up. But if you can sense that point on the curve, yeah, where it's the right time to reimagine and to think about strategy, in other words, on the way up, see, you can get a way forward where you actually minimize the down and maximize the up. Yeah. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we were having lots of conversations with charities that were in a survival mode set. They were in decline, they were over the curve. So thinking about your organization, where are you on that curve? Yeah. And then in the last 2-3 years, especially after COVID, organizations are trying to reimagine themselves. They're saying, actually, we're quite cash rich at the moment, or, we've done relatively well through COVID. How do we reimagine to have greater impact for the future? But what we're seeing with the downturn in the economy, what we're seeing at the moment with cost of living increase, what we're seeing with, the problems that are playing out in the economy at the moment, is people are turning back to survival thinking. Now, survival thinking is not a good reason to go back and rethink your strategy. It's a good reason to rethink your tactics, but it's only when you're reimagining or trying to do something different or do more for those that you exist for that you're really going to reimagine your strategy. So you're going to go into a survival mindset. Think of different tactics that you might use to help you through that. I hope you can see that difference now between strategy and tactics. So I've got a couple of questions coming. Let's go to the next slide, Dan. And let's see if we can pick up the questions as we go. I think before I move and I pass back to Dan to talk about it, we're talking really, if you like, sort of, at a high level here. When is it time to look at your strategy? It's when you start on this decline curve. Yeah. Once you start on the decline and you can feel you're doing less and you're having to work harder to do that, you really do need to ask that question. How do we improve? Yeah. I like to think of stress testing a little bit of organizations every year. So you might pick up a big question that you want to answer, or you might want to stress test, for example, I don't know, your advocacy work, just seeing whether you make a difference, whether you're securing the right type of conversations. Yeah. So stress testing something every year is really important. And Dan and myself tend to have a lot of conversations about what is the forward timescale for your strategy? Yeah. Is it 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 20 years? Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you are creating, I don't know, long-term change in a community or a humanitarian situation, you're probably thinking very, very long-term. Yeah. So your strategy around building, for example, fresh water in communities is going to be very long-term. Research, pharmaceuticals, medical charities tend to think in a much longer time span. If, on the other hand, you're thinking about humanitarian aid, you might only be able to think in a very short-term way. You need a strategy to get in, help people, and get out. Yeah. that might lead you to a 1 year timescale, really, as a strategic intervention. But we tend to see 3 to 5 years as the right type of if you like, forward timescale for which to do your strategy. 3 years, over 3 years, and especially in the economic environment at the moment, over 5 years, you're really not going to know what's coming down the road. So getting this balance, if you like, between looking long term versus having tactics to see you through 1 year or 2 years is really interesting. And I think 3 years is probably all we can think of at the moment. And so I kind of like to think about doing a proper full strategy review, every 5 years, but doing strategic refreshes every 3 years. So Dan and myself thought we'd make it a little bit more interactive. And Veronica, thank you for the comment. Yeah, just pop into the Q&A, can you? What's your timescale for your strategy? Yeah, so let's just have a bit of feedback here. What's the timescale that you've got for your strategy? So just pop it into the Q&A, and we'll see a few people and what they think, because everybody's different. Yeah. So Nicola Lawson, 3 years. Maria, 3 years, but updated annually. Anna, 3 years. 3 years. Kate Hamilton, 5 years. 3 years. David Roberts, 3 years. And Veronica, we have a rolling strategy. That's fantastic. Yeah. In other words, you are going and looking at the important things, every year, and maybe challenging yourself a bit further every 2 or 3 years. Martin Tyler, 6 years, principally as 100 years in 6. Okay, so our main charity is 5 years, but internal fundraising reviews are 3 years. So you see that everybody's slightly different, yeah? And that timescale is something you're going to have to address when you set a good charity strategy process. Dan, I'm going to hand back to you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for the feedback, everyone, on the timescale. Let me move on. So we're now going to jump into the sort of the real meat of today's session, and sort of building on what Mark's talked about in terms of what strategies look like. And we find that when we work with charities on their strategy processes, we break the process down into 3 phases. And Mark sort of alluded to those already. And you'll see these 3 phases sort of echoed or reflected in some of the further slides that we talk about, and some of the models that are out there as well. So first, you need to know where you are. And then you need to think about where you want to get to. And then you want to work out how you're going to get there, and with what resource. So sounds pretty easy, really. So there you go. We've done it. We've told you how to do the process. No, there's probably a bit more to it than that. And the last point on this slide is sort of the key one, that it requires great questions, or asking great questions, because as sort of Mark's talked about already, when you're thinking about strategy, it's easy to get sucked into just doing tactics, and you really need to think about what are the great questions that you can ask, so that you really get to the important things in challenging where you are now and where you want to be. So how do you ask those great questions? I'm going to go through a few slides just with some thoughts on asking great questions. So the first is a model which those of you who've been on our sessions before may have seen. This is a model called RISE. It's something that Mark helped to create, and it's based on the acronym for reimagining impact, sustainability, and efficiency, and looking at an organization through those 4 lenses, and asking the sorts of questions that you can see on the screen there. But in the process of using RISE to think about strategies, we also found that it was important to ask about resources, ask about the people, the leadership, the culture, and I'll go into more detail on the importance of that a little bit later. So without the people sort of on board, embedding long-lasting change won't really happen. And then partly because I'm a fundraising specialist, I suppose, but partly because fundraising is often the main driver of having enough income to fund change, we've also felt that it was important to talk about fundraising or around issues to do with income generation. And how are you going to have the resources that you need to make your dreams and aspirations in your strategy a reality? So here are a range of great questions that can get you started on both thinking about where you are now and also starting to think about where you might be as well. And you can see, like under reimagining, how do you reimagine products and services to increase the impact for beneficiaries? That's very much thinking about where you might go to. And another tool which I gave a sneak peek of just a moment ago, and again, diehards of our webinars will have seen this before, but it's a great tool, and we keep going back to it. This 2x2 grid helps you to ask questions about a charity's activities to focus future strategies on activities that will create both high impact and generate a surplus. So the ones that are up in this top right-hand corner. So plotting where your service lines fit on this grid is a way then to ask questions about those activities, those service lines, as to whether they are the most have the most strategic fit with where your organization is and wants to go. It can also help you deal with sacred cows, which is something that we're going to mention a little bit later, which may well be sitting in other squares other than the one in the top right-hand corner. So I see Lars Erik, you've raised your hand. I'm not sure why. Did you want to put something into the Q&A to or maybe you raised your hand accidentally? If you could let us know what's up, then we can respond. So
can I say a little bit more about this, Dan? Yeah, just at this point, because what we've tended to find in our work, haven't we, Dan, is that people think either about, impact and start to think about impact, but almost forget about the money, if you like, and what it costs. And working at how much things cost, where you can really look at what's the direct cost, you can have the overheads to come to a real fully costed picture, and then aligning that with impact is quite an interesting thing, because then you can see really where you're using your resources versus other organizations we work with that really look at the money but don't think about the impact. Yeah. And so actually, how can you make really good decisions unless you crosshatch these two? Yeah. How can you see if something's creating low impact or and at the same time, is really not profitable and drawing on resources? Maybe you should consider maybe even stopping that. Yeah. How can you have that conversation without mapping out the money that you use or the resources you use versus the impact it creates? So we tend to do a lot of this work, don't we, Dan? Helping people think about where they sit on this grid and then how they move and strategically, if you like, move their services around the grid.
And yeah, I guess within that, we do acknowledge it's not easy. Working out what lies where, working out what your impact is something that probably less than 50% of charities have actually really cracked, and working out which of your activity areas are actually really generating a surplus or not takes quite a lot of careful cost analysis as well. So Jules, you've just put in that you agree with the challenge of the balance of impact versus surplus. We look at a new meter. And did you have an example of a new meter helping?
I've never heard about that, Jules.
No.
So we'd love you to type into the chat what a new meter is. Or is it a process?
Oh, I see, a NOAA meter. I get, yes, thank you, Jules. Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So you preempted where we're going. Let's move on. So when we think about other questions, another one, great question is what is driving change? We haven't just put this slide up because we love the picture, although it is a great picture, and that car's not really driving anywhere right now. So there are a few things which might be driving the change that you have in your organization, and that's driving you in the direction of working through your strategy. One of those things may be an elephant in the room, or rather than an elephant on the car. And often these elephants in the room, they're large intractable issues which are hard to solve. So we either don't try to solve them, or we don't even mention them at all. I'm sure you will all be aware of elephants in the room in your charities, and really you need to get them out in the open. You need to write some elephant papers, as we described there, which is something that we sometimes challenge clients to charities to work on, to flesh out the issues, and to be upfront about what these elephants are, and to start to try to tackle them. And though you shouldn't really be eating elephants, the joke is, how do you eat an elephant? One spoon at a time. That's one of Mark's favorites. But you won't get it all in your mouth. But if you do it, get it out in the open and start one spoon at a time, then you've got a chance of getting all the way through there. The other thing that you need to think about when you ask what's driving change is evidence. Having enough data. The strategy needs to be evidence-based. You need to have the data to drive change effectively in your chosen direction. As you might say, our Chancellor has found out recently, but I'm not going to get any more political than that. But you'll also probably need to be prepared to stop doing things, as Jules was describing just then, just earlier. And having the bravery to stop doing things is often one of the areas that charities that we work with sort of struggle with the most. Many of the things that they're doing are good or worthy things, or certainly have been in the past, and it's hard to then see that stuff is changing, and the reasons, the validation for doing these things is not necessarily the same as it was. So funding opportunities may have changed, and so you're now not able to operate in the same way financially as you were before, or your beneficiaries' needs are changing or shifting, and what you're providing to them isn't quite what they're asking for, and you need to be able to stop doing one thing that you're doing and maybe start doing something different. Or your service model has stopped being as effective as it could be. So it's still something that people need, but you've lost some of your efficiency or your effectiveness, and you need to stop doing that and start doing something different. Inertia won't drive change, and inertia is often something which is a besetting thing in charities, and they carry on doing the things that they've always done. Maybe that's an elephant in the room in your case. So bold decisions are needed to stop the activities that lie in the wrong boxes in this 2x2 grid. So particularly if you've got something that's in the bottom left-hand grid, it's neither creating financial or social value, you need to be bold and to acknowledge that, and to make a decision to stop doing that. And ultimately that will pay off both for your charity and for your beneficiaries. And then the last thing to talk about is innovation. A good rule is that innovation should be there driving forward your strategy. The things that Mark was talking about earlier in terms of reimagining, that's all about where innovation comes in. That is the time when you think about reimagining, is when you should be thinking about new strategies. A good rule is that maybe about 20% of your effort should be allocated to try and think of the new things that you could do that will become tomorrow's business as usual. And if you look back, that's probably the pattern of how things have been, and what now is business as usual was once upon a time new and innovative. And so we need to keep on thinking about the new stuff, because that will become much more normal. Zoom, for example, as we're on at the moment, back in 2018, 2019, that was quite innovative. That was a fairly new thing. It wasn't really taken up by many people. Most people had never heard of the company Zoom, and look at us now. So things change, and if we don't invest in that innovation, we'll miss out on that. So we've thought a lot about great questions, but the next thing to think about is who you ask. And I've got a couple of slides on that, some quick thoughts on engaging with stakeholders, because that's a key part of the process. First, you'll need to have a wide range of insights. So if you're asking great questions, you need to ask lots of people in order to get some good insights in the answers that you have. You'll also need to choreograph your process well. And this model from Kotter is one of many different change models are out there. It is one that we think is useful. There's sort of three sections here. It's sort of making making sure that people are geared up and ready for change. Then it's empowering your people to make those changes. And then it's at the end, the red bits, resetting the organization so that its people are focused around the new change and the new strategy that you want to embed. Those three steps, they maybe reflect the thinking about where you are, thinking about where you want to go, and then working out how you're going to get there. But with all of this, it is important to remember the famous phrase by Drucker that the culture eats strategy for breakfast. If your wider stakeholders aren't behind you, your new plans won't really gain traction, and the culture out there will overrule whatever great strategies you might have thought about if you thought about them in a vacuum, or if you haven't really engaged with your wider stakeholders, the people who have an influence and who can change what happens in the future and how your strategy could have been embedded. Again, parallels for the wider UK context, but I won't go any further on that. So when you think about who you're going to involve, there's also thinking about all the different people involved. You can't have everyone writing the same strategy. That would be unworkable. That's sort of the equivalent of a committee trying to create a camel. But it is important to consider the roles of different people that they have within the process, and to think about that carefully from the beginning. Where does the CEO fit in? I know we've got quite a lot of CEOs on this call today, so make sure that you understand sort of where what you're doing within the strategy process, where that starts and stops, where your chair's role starts and stops, where the board are involved and how involved they are. Who are the different stakeholders that you need to consult with? Who are the ones who can make or break your strategy as you roll it out? Those are the ones who have a real stake in your organization, and you need to make sure that you've created a route to involve them. Your senior management team need to be involved. They're the ones who will know what's to some extent what's happening within the organization, and they will be able to inform and advise. And then if you're a large organization, you should be involving your staff representatives. Again, the more you go down the organization's hierarchy, the more you have people who actually know what's happening on the ground and what the reality is in terms of how you're delivering your services or meeting your beneficiaries' needs. Forming a steering group is invaluable within that. Having a group of people who are involved, hopefully a broad and inclusive group who are able to make your strategy turn into a reality at the end. They should be able to share the burden, to reduce groupthink, and promote a future strategy. And so it's important to think about where responsibility and accountability lie, and also make sure that you've got good two-way communication channels so that you're not creating your strategy in a vacuum. And so I'm now going to, I think, hand over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit more about
before you moved on from this slide, Dan, I think there's two really, really important things on this slide. I mean, the first thing is that the board can't ultimately delegate responsibility for strategy. They have the fiduciary duty for the charity, so they really do have to set the strategy. But what they'll quite often do is delegate it to either a steering group or the chief executive, yeah. And this is where I think it's really important, because the chief executive and SMT will also want to really shape what's going on. So this tension between how do you include the board and how the CEO, and the SMT manage that process is really key. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And sorting that out in the beginning, Dan, is something that we have to do a lot of. In other words, who do we want round the table? What's the politics here? The second thing is, I firmly believe that unless you go and ask stakeholders, in other words, beneficiaries and those who exist for, and include them in the process, then you won't get the best outcome, because you're just not including people in the process when actually the charity maybe exists for those people. So it's really important to say, okay, maybe if we are working, I don't know, in a school or for those with autism, as we have been recently, how do you engage with what somebody with autism really wants from that school? Yeah, making sure that you're really clear about listening carefully to what people want, and then you can feed that back into your strategy process. So that's why we have this lovely pointy finger question mark diagram on the right hand side. Next slide then. And we tend to find a lot of organizations saying we're going to cut. And I think there's another side to cutting, which is growth. And you can cut services, you can cut infrastructure, you can cut support, if you like, to give yourself the space or the reserves to then grow and invest. But that's quite hard, yeah. A lot of organizations that we tend to work with have a little bit of reserves there, which they can invest for the future. And so we took one client here, and we said to them, okay, you want to start building your services, but you can't grow your services unless you've got the infrastructure right, and you can't grow your services until you've got the money to do so. So we think you're going to have to sequence something around fundraising. We think that you need to actually invest for 2-3 years in fundraising, which will then give you the ability to invest more in infrastructure, which will give you then ultimately the chance to do more services. And so just having this ability to phase and to really have good conversations about how do you phase the changes is incredibly important. And anybody who knows me well enough knows that I talk at length about infrastructure, but for a good reason, because if you don't have the scaffolding in place, you won't be able to grow. And so spending more and challenging yourself, really, what do we need in terms of infrastructure to be able to grow is critical. A lot of work from Stanford Social Innovation has said, look, we've got a starvation cycle here going on. And if we don't invest in infrastructure, we won't have the scaffolding for the future. And a lot of charities are denuding themselves, so they now can't grow. In other words, they haven't invested in that infrastructure. So phasing, get it right. Next slide, please, Dan, if I can. And so, yeah, what comes out of the other end? It's quite interesting, you know, coming out of your strategy process. It's quite a short list, really. I mean, you should know where you're trying to get to, what the picture looks like. You know, that picture of London and London city skyline. We should be able to articulate that clearly so that people can see, all stakeholders can see their place in it, and it's clear to staff and trustees, etc. Implementation plan, good old Gantt charts. What are we going to do when to transform the organization? Yeah. And linking into that, what's our resource plans? What HR do we need? What talent do we need? What about budgets? You know, what about the money side of things? And I think the bottom two is what we quite often forget, yeah, which is there are risks that will stop us achieving our strategy. How do we you know, deal with those risks? How do we remove the barriers and accentuate the positives to move us forward? That's the Japanese school of looking at strategy. In other words, remove the barriers, accentuate the positives, but paint a picture and just move towards that. And we need to have an idea of both risks and risk appetite. In other words, what are we going to do to remove those things that will stop us, but also where are we going to invest, yeah, for the future? And then the final thing is key performance indicators. In other words, if we've got a direction and we're getting pulled off direction, how are we going to see whether we can get ourselves back on track? We need some indicators to be able to fly that plane. And also, if we are going off track, something to tell us that we're going off track, and then ask the difficult questions. What are we going to do about it? Yeah. And quite a lot of strategy work I've been involved in the past, we didn't know the answer. We had to be agile, we had to learn, we had to move, but we needed some like sort of, if you like, key performance indicators to challenge if we were delivering or not. So just in summary, you know, you're going to need a clear strategic ambition. You're going to need implementation plans, resource plans, an idea of risk and risk appetite, and key performance indicators. So I think we're coming to the end of this slide deck now, Dan. So I'm just going to move on to issues and implications. Here's a slide that Dan and myself pulled together. We think of the biggest issues. The first one is not thinking enough about impact. Lots of organizations just think about the money. They don't think about how that then generates change and social change for people. So thinking more about the impact is important. And obviously the other way around, not thinking enough about money, just thinking about the social change we're creating, not thinking about how we're going to fund or resource that. I think the third one down is really interesting. We find lots of organizations where there are different pockets of beliefs. And so everyone needs to have a chance to speak. And having a voice in this process is really important, because otherwise you feel excluded. You're not going to bring people on this journey unless you give them a voice and you give them a chance to comment. And so having that, if you like, ability for groups of people to give their feedback and to give their thoughts on the future direction is incredibly important. Yeah. We see disconnects between trustees, leadership, SMT. How do we bring people together in conversations? Well, pull them into a room, give them a chance to have a voice. We see working in silos instead of across organization. We'll just pull different groups of people into conversations, and they'll find a common way, because if you give them a vision, if you like, they can see their part in that. And that's a great way then to break down silos. So for example, you say, in humanitarian aid, we're going to try and save this person's life. Who do we put in the chair that we're going to help? And then finance and operations and fundraising and advocacy can all advocate and look at that person in the chair and say, now we know exactly who we exist for, and can see their part in helping that person. As Dan said, quite often we avoid the elephant in the room. I think, the other side of that is sacred cows. There's a lot of founding beliefs that we quite often never challenge. Yeah. And so, what are the big things we haven't really discussed, the elephants, which we are going to have to discuss? And what are the beliefs we're going to have to challenge, and the sacred cows we might have to actually address to move us forward, to be able to ask great questions? Yeah. So, for example, with cats protection, we didn't really know if neutering was a good or a bad thing. We had to go and challenge that sacred cow because we didn't know. Yeah. And then we had to get somebody to do some research and to make sure we had our case in terms of neutering, and the pros and cons, the pluses and minuses, really nailed down. So those are the things that we saw really as common issues. So Dan,
I think it's partly it's a number of these things sort of do come back to leadership issues, and it's also sort of about having the strength to be vulnerable. If that, then that's not meant to be an oxymoron. That in order to be able to have that strength to be vulnerable, to be able to listen, to hear things that you don't want to hear, to be able to have stuff challenged that you would prefer to be unchallenged. And by doing so, that's when breakthroughs actually do happen, and when that sort of that sort of blue sky thinking kind of strategy that Mark was talking about is particularly more significant. And when you ultimately get that speedier upward growth curve from the one that we saw right at the beginning. So that's sort of an important sort of psychosocial thing that is part of the process as well. And somebody said earlier in the Q&A about bringing people with you is critical to getting your strategy process right. And again, sort of vulnerability is maybe one of the strengths that can help you to bring people with you in a way that everybody sort of wants to be there. So the last slide that we're going to sort of present to you is sort of what next. So we've talked about a lot of stuff today. We hope that it's been useful. And one of the things that we've used with a number of charities is our own nonprofit 360 diagnostic tool. This little wheel here is an example of it. It's a way to start off that process. You remember the first question, where are we now? It's really a great way to review your organization and to ask where are you now. It's got 36 sort of key questions spread across these 9 different domains, and you can then sort of ask those questions and find the answers. And then that is a great starting point for change, and those answers will probably give you an inkling towards where do you want to go. And with some of the charities that we've worked with, they've done that process with their SMT, with their board, and with other key members of staff. So it also helps in some of those issues that we've just been looking at. previously around it's an ideal tool maybe to dispense of the issues of silo working or of tensions between board and executive, and gives everybody a chance to think about some of the bigger issues and also to get their answers down in a way that you can then really understand where your organization is at, where the strengths and weaknesses are, where the things are that you then need to address in order to move forward and to create your new strategy. And if that's something that you're interested in then there'll be something in the email that follows on from this webinar, or simply get in touch with me to ask me more about how that works. People have been putting questions into the Q&A.
Well, I was going to say, Dan, the Q&A has been working, but also Vanessa said that we can actually open up the line so that we can talk to people direct, which might be a nice thing to do. Yeah. So
okay, it would be good to
should we just actually open it up so that we can choose people to actually have a conversation, and people can raise their hands. Yeah. So Vanessa, if you just,
I'm going to stop sharing so that
yeah, because the chat's not working. Vanessa, if you can just open up the panel. Hester, you've just come into the conversation, Shabina, etc. So
do you want to say something, Shabina? Your hand is up. So.
And then we'll come to Hester after that, please.
You want to unmute yourself and
sorry, it's Hester. I didn't mean to put my hand up, I don't think.
Okay. Did you want to say something, Hester?
No, other than the fact this is absolutely brilliant and really great timing for us. And just loads of great stuff. I don't have a question at the moment. It all makes sense. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Shabina, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, mine just automatically came up as well. But yeah, this is actually great timing because we are actually looking at our fundraising review at the moment, so seeing how are we kind of hitting our strategic targets, and also because we've started to engage more with our stakeholders to try and make sure that what we're doing going forward actually does involve, you know, their viewpoints in there, and also the whole thing about change of culture. There's been a few points that have been raised about sometimes we're a bit out of touch with what's currently going on with some of our appeals, so it's good to kind of start thinking about all of that now as well. But yeah, this is just great time, and thank you.
You're welcome. Certainly talking to your stakeholders is always invaluable. It will always give you insights which you probably would struggle to come up with within your organization. It can help within an organization to have users, beneficiaries who have a role on your board or in your staff teams, and that's obviously not something every charity can do, but where you can, that's also an invaluable way to get those kinds of insights, which will help to really drive the direction that you're going into, one that resonates most, particularly on the impact side. And then if you can then be smart and work out ways to increase your the ability to deliver a surplus, then you're hitting that sweet spot in the top right hand corner of our 2x2 grid, which is sort of where the best sort of strategic directions lie.
And Dan, can I say something completely outrageous? Yeah, which is at Cats Protection, we couldn't go and ask a cat whether neutering was a good idea or spaying was a good idea or not. So we had to do everything through proxies. So don't be afraid to actually go out and find proxies, you know, that can help you solve these dilemmas, if you like. Carl, you've got your hand up, and it's lovely. You come along to a lot of these webinars. So what's your take on strategy, Carl?
Well, hopefully you can hear me because I'm using a headset. So
yeah, we can hear you clearly. Yeah,
loud and clear.
Cool. Yeah, we tore up all of our strategy papers in 2000, 2001, and just that's all gone. We put together a high-level strategy, which was 2022 to 2025. We only involved the board in looking at where do they see the organization going by 2025, not the intervening years. We did the where are we now exercise, or I did the where are we now exercise, and then tried to articulate in terms of 2022's strategy or operational plan what we will be doing this year. What we found, and it was really an emergency type, this is how to get the charity through the next 12 months, was the main thrust of the exercise.
Yeah.
But the problem with that was that although we've got the board broadly involved in deciding all of the different 10 or 12 areas of the direction we wanted to go or where we wanted to be, we weren't carrying through the stakeholders, the staff, and so this year has been a source of a number of conflicts and frictions and so on. So mainly because there are some issues that we just haven't been able to disclose where we were with certain things. You know, I've just refinanced a mortgage, which has taken 6 or 7 months to complete, but we couldn't disclose what was going on about that for obvious reasons. We are now looking at the 2023 operational plan process starting. I think what you've just been articulating is important, that we now need to include those other stakeholders in what their vision is for 2025 and then work it backwards to what we'll do next year.
Yeah. I think that in that sort of process, you've got different people within your organisation. Some are accountable for the strategy working, some are responsible for it working, and some need to be informed or communicated, and to sort of be able to contribute. And it's good to sort of segment up your different stakeholders and work out which ones are which, and ensure that those who aren't accountable or responsible but are able to inform know which role they're playing, but to let them play that role as well, and hopefully that will help to minimize confusion and conflict. But so yeah, good luck with that, Carl.
And also, Carl, I was going to say something, which is people are genuinely thrilled to be involved and to be asked. And suddenly if you've got a group of really engaged people, they will go further and beyond. And so, what we tend to think is we should hold the strategy process really close. I think the brave thing is to let it fly and get groups of people really thinking about things. The flip side of that is it can appear as if they can have the world. In other words, they can do everything they want when maybe they can't. Yeah. But I do really think that you can engage people by just saying, actually, we're not controlling all of this, but we really want your feedback. Go away, have some deep conversations, come back and tell us what you think. And I think they'll be thrilled in that, Carl, in my experience.
I mean, just to pick up on it's a slightly parallel subject, but we went out and we want to expand our board, and we wanted more parent representatives. For those that don't know, I run a gymnastics charity, and we wanted more parents' voices on the board and so on. And we asked the question, who's interested, and literally within half an hour of asking the question, we had 5 people put their hand up, and 3 of which were very well qualified people that we hope by next month we'll have added to the board. But it is that very thing that people are thrilled to be asked, and that was a lot of the feedback was, we never knew that we had the opportunity to join the board, and so.
So, Carl, we're going to have to move on, okay. I'm afraid, and thank you. Yeah. We've got Martin, I think, as probably our last question, haven't we, Dan? Until before we wrap up.
Like it, yes.
So, Martin, please.
It's thank you so much. Really interesting seminar today. I just wanted to really reinforce the point that, in my experience, strategy has to really inspire and motivate people. It has to be the thing that gets somebody out of bed in the morning. And to do that, I think people really need to be clear about their part in that. And in my experience, developing strategy, you really have to, the stakeholder mapping is a really critical part, because you've got to really understand who the different stakeholders are. And in identifying those stakeholders, the staff is obviously a very key stakeholder. And in the work that I've done before, trying to identify, you know, those key influences is really important. And some of them actually are not the obvious ones. Some of them are sometimes perceived as the difficult ones, but what they say and what their views are in the organization are so important. So getting those people early on side can really make a difference to how that strategy can you know, stick and really motivate people and inspire people.
I think that's really well said, Martin, and actually rounds off our strategy seminar quite well, or workshop quite well, Dan, doesn't it? And thank you, Martin, for sharing. I actually really enjoyed just turning on the mic and hearing people's voices. So, Dan,
yeah, I think it's 5 o'clock or nearly 5 o'clock. So we say with these sessions should be an hour, and this one is going to be. So that's great. Thank you for your interaction, your comments. Thank you for coming along. That there will be a copy of the recording of this sent to you shortly in the next few days, and with more information. And do get in touch if you've got further questions, or if you want to know a little bit more detail about how we do these things, or if somebody said that it would be great for their trustees. Yeah, if you want us to come and talk to your trustees, let us know. We'd be happy to engage with them as well. Thanks very much, and see you at the next one.